Hey, why don't we get started? Thanks everybody for joining us today. This discussion is going to be about the network sustainability mechanism, or what we call the NSM. It was previously called the Zcash Sustainability Fund. And the reason that we're hosting this discussion is to explain to the community what the NSM is, why we think it's important, clear up misconceptions about it, and give the community the opportunity to provide feedback and ask questions. It's not intended to be too technical of a conversation. So if you have any questions, no matter what they are, feel free to ask. We've got Zuko, Nate, and me from Shielded Labs, Chris Nuttycombe from ECC, and Squirrel, aka Jason from Zech Hub. If anyone has any questions at any point, I'll bring you up on stage to ask them. But before we get into the discussion, I just wanted to give some brief, excuse me, some brief background on the project. So the NSM attempts to address a problem similar to Bitcoin security budget dilemma. And this is where block rewards may eventually fail to provide sufficient incentives for miners to secure the network. In Bitcoin, the rewards halve every 4 years, and then the network has to increasingly rely on transaction fees, which may not be enough to sustain the network over the long term. So there have been discussions about things like adding tail emissions that would breach Bitcoin's 21 million coin cap, or whether or not Bitcoin's price will be high enough for transaction fees to compensate miners adequately. Since Zcash is a fork of Bitcoin that it halves every 4 years, is capped at 21 million, the NSM is trying to get ahead of this problem. It was originally proposed by Nate Wilcox when he was at the Electric Coin Company back in 2022. He called it the Zcash Posterity Fund. And in a nutshell, Nate proposed a modification to the issuance mechanism that would maintain the 21 million coin cap, enable deposits from ZEC from the circulating supply that could be used in future block rewards to sustain the network. So what this meant in simple terms was that, like, for example, a percentage of transaction fees could be deposited into the fund and paid out into future block rewards at some point further along the emissions curve to miners or a dev fund if one still existed, or whatever replaced that. And then when Shielded Labs first started working on this last year, we adopted this idea of it as a fund, but we slightly renamed it to the Zcash Sustainability Fund. The problem that we ran into was calling it a fund created a lot of confusion. So people confused it with like the dev fund, or thought there was some organization that controlled it or was a beneficiary of it. And that wasn't the case. It's completely controlled by the protocol, and any ZEC deposited into the fund is tracked by the consensus rules. So when Zuko came on, we thought of ways to reconceptualize the project. And Zuko suggested the terms burning and minting instead of depositing and distributions. And then we agreed on the name network sustainability mechanism to sort of get away from the confusion of calling it a fund or even thinking of it as a thing. So
Hey,
we,
can I interrupt?
yeah, go for it.
Just because you were giving me credit for that, I want to mention that a lot of my motivation in suggesting that came from these conversations with Abe Sutherland, a crypto lawyer who's
Yeah.
currently helping somebody named Jarrett sue the IRS over staking taxes. But anyway, just wanted to give a shout out to Abe Sutherland, I guess, for that idea.
Yeah, that's great. Um, Yeah, and so we think that this is a way that just sort of makes it easier for us to explain and also easier for the community to understand. And like Zuko said, it sort of separates it from any sort of future legal or taxation issues that might arise as a part of like current litigation that's occurring. So real quick, like, what is the network sustainability mechanism? Why does it matter? So the NSM is an upgrade to the issuance mechanism. It maintains the 21 million coin cap. It enables the burning of ZEC from the circulating supply, and that can be reintroduced in future block rewards to help sustain the network. This is important because for the first time ever, it enables donations to be made directly to the Zcash network instead of solely to like a development organization or individuals. And there are exciting number of future use cases that it enables, including donations from like wallets or other means, fees for Zcash shielded assets, um, deprecation of old pools. But we'll get more into that later in the call. And then lastly, the thing I wanted to say is that there are three zips associated with the implementation that you'll hear us discuss throughout today's session. One zip, zip 233, establishes this voluntary burn mechanism. Zip 234 smooths out the issuance curve, which is necessary because it enables burned coins to be reintroduced into circulation in a straightforward and predictable manner. And then ZIP 235 proposes to burn 60% of transaction fees to help sustain the network. Sounds like a lot, but it's actually a very small amount, which is like it's like 210 ZEC per year. So we've completed implementations for both Zcash-D and ZebraD, and now we're working with the community to determine, how and when the NSM will be implemented into the protocol. All right, so that's probably enough background for now. So Nate, why don't we start with you? Can you talk a little bit about, your motivation behind originally proposing what is now called the network sustainability mechanism?
Yeah. So, uh, let's see. One thing is that you framed it in terms of Bitcoin, which is useful for people who've been like tracking that Bitcoin issue, which is what to do when the halving schedule, the issuance grows too small. And that is interesting to me, but that's pretty far out in the future. I was actually more motivated by um, things closer in time. And um, so, yeah, part of my motivation was wanting. So this was also around the time when we were discussing ZSAs and whether or not, like, what the economic implications for the ZEC coin might be for ZSAs. And during that period, we were also brainstorming a bunch of different ways to have different kinds of fees. And I wanted a way to have fees paid that would just support the network in general, kind of neutrally, in the same way that the issuance works. So I just thought, well, let's combine those two. And then the next piece is that I wanted to keep the 21 million ZEC cap. And generally, the one feature of the halving is that every 4 years there's half as much issuance as previously. I kind of wanted to keep that time scale, and I didn't want to um, alter that time scale because something about that seems really useful or important to me. Because it's so slow, like 4 years is a long time to change by half. That it let like my thinking is it just lets everyone sort of adapt to what the network is doing and make their plans based on that. Like a 4-year plan for me is a pretty solid plan. And that's like long enough that I'm gonna be able to like plan pieces of my life around that, right? Like what am I doing for my career? Where will my kids be going to school? That kind of time range seems important to keep steady, because I've always had this vision that the more and more people can rely on Zcash, the more stability it might be able to bring. So I just sort of tied those all together, thinking, okay, well, and I was also very inspired by seeing EIP 1559 in Ethereum, where they were now proposing that a portion of fees would be burnt as well as this is a little bit of a tangent, but also as well as having sort of a network managed fee schedule, which I like for some other reasons. That's a little bit tangential, but since I was inspired by that, I was like, hey, how could we benefit from burning? And then finally, what we're now calling the sustainability mechanism was basically the simplest way I could think of to be like, how can we tie together that whenever ZEC is burnt, it feeds into issuance, but we're still maintaining the 21 million ZEC cap and the 4-year sort of half-life. And that's kind of where it came from.
Zuko, do you want to chime in and give us your thoughts on the NSM and why you support it?
Um, yeah. Trying to organize my thoughts. I really agree with the primary motivation that the Bitcoin supply schedule is unmaintainable. Like, I love Bitcoin for being early and having a whole lot of usage and attention so we can learn from it, like, confidently. Um, and the thing about what Jason mentioned, that it's not clear that the price of Bitcoin could be enough for the dwindling issuance to support the network. That's totally got to be correct, because for the Bitcoin network to get the same level of new issuance, when the issuance supply halves every year, then the price of Bitcoin would have to double every year. So a long time ago, I kind of thought, like, before I thought that through, I wasn't really worried about the declining Bitcoin issuance, because I thought, the price of Bitcoin can go up and up and up. But then once I realized, well, it actually has to double every 4 years, that's eventually bound to run out. It cannot double every 4 years indefinitely, only a few times. Um, so that's definitely like an unsolved problem. And I really care about the long term effects on Zcash, because I'm very much a Zec bull, and I'm totally confident that it'll be super important and valuable in 5 and 10 years from now. So I'm really motivated by long term stuff. Um, and there's something I'm still struggling to put my finger on it, but there's something I really love about the network sustainability mechanism design, which is it, like, I think Nathan alluded to something about everyone being able to understand and rely on something about Zcash. That is something I learned from Nick Szabo's blog post or whatever, where he talked about social scalability. I've seen a lot that you can have an inner group of how many people do we have in here? Like, less than 100 people in here, right? Who understand a whole bunch of details. And then when you expand out to a bigger circle of like 10,000 people, then they understand very little. Like, they only understand 10% of the details, because they don't have time, and they're not uh, prioritizing all the ins and outs, like core engineers are. And then you expand to like 10 million people, and they understand almost nothing, right? There's just like one fact that they're gonna remember, or one concept, or whatever, one brand, and so on. And so I really like the fact that the 21 million cap is sort of the one fact that anyone knows about Bitcoin, like 99% of people or whatever. And similarly, it's something that the network sustainability mechanism can sort of make it reliable and long-term reliable and sustainable for Zcash. And one more thing about it that kind of intriguing to me, that I haven't figured out how to express, is that the network sustainability mechanism design makes it so that you can have short-term boosts to Zcash's scarcity. If somebody burns a bunch of Zcash coins, that's increasing scarcity, and it's effectively giving value to all the other Zcash holders who didn't burn their coins. And you can do that, and like Jason says, that's sort of a credibly neutral contribution to the entire Zcash project. Like, all the holders and the miners and any dev fund or lockbox or whatever recipients, they're all getting that benefit directly and independently when someone burns their Zcash coins. Um, but it with the network sustainability mechanism, that just doesn't change the socially scalable fact of the 21 million ultimate supply. So it's a fascinating balance between short term and long term.
Chris, do you want to give us some of your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's particularly interesting in the context of uh, network fees for specific events, like ZSA issuance is one that is top of my mind. Um, I think that it doesn't really make sense for these like potentially large fee events. I mean, we don't really know what ZSA fees are going to be yet, but in order to avoid sort of DOS problems, fees will probably want to be significant enough to deter like large scale malicious attacks. And but in those cases, I don't know that it makes sense for uh, like a particular miner to get an outsized fee. And so the possibility of just having those fees essentially donated back to the future of the Zcash network makes a ton of sense to me.
Okay, Jason, is there anything you wanted to add or any questions that you had related to this topic?
Yeah, so if I'm not mistaken, it's did I hear 60% of fees, transaction fees, are going into the or might go into the NSM?
Yeah, so ZIP 235 has a consensus level change as it's currently proposed that would result in 60% of transaction fees going into or being burned. Let's just use our current
Okay, yeah.
terminology. And so that accounts for, by our estimates, about 210 ZEC a year, which is pretty minimal.
So,
Yeah.
I wanted to mention
Sorry.
something about that. That piece specifically, there are a couple of ways that one can go about it. It can be a uh, essentially either done via a protocol consensus change, or it could be done via a essentially a minor opt-in or wallet opt-in kind of approach, or a combination thereof.
On
Yeah.
that point, Chris, could I ask, does it then like perhaps somehow increase the attack surface of Zcash? Like, I imagine something like this is probably hard to test because, like, I don't know, you could probably only model it, and yeah, how would you go about making sure it's like watertight?
I'm not sure of what kinds of attacks you're considering here.
There is a way in
I'm
which it
thinking like,
reduces the tax, but go on.
Yeah, I don't see an increased attack surface one way or the other. I mean, especially right now, given that the the fiat value of fees is tiny, right? Um, a couple hundred ZEC a year is not much value. It's almost ignorable, I think, for most network participants.
okay, one more very silly question. So coins are mined now from Coinbase, not the exchange, but the Zcash Coinbase. So when NSM kicks in, does does the Coinbase disappear and then it's just ZSF? And if so, what happens to shielded Coinbase?
It's a silly question.
Okay,
That's a
so
great
I
question.
think there's a misunderstanding about what Coinbase is, right? Coinbase is the issuance schedule, and this zip does suggest a change to the issuance schedule, or at least the smoothing in zip 234 does suggest that change to the issuance schedule. But in terms of the individual an individual block, the Coinbase transaction in that block will still create new issuance split between, or at least, if it activates at the same, well, we'll talk later about activation timing, but the new issuance in that block is determined according to the algorithm defined in zip 234, and that is value that goes into outputs that go to the miners and ZSF and the in protocol lockbox that was activated in NU, or that will activate in NU6. So however that split of new issuance is defined, that continues to be, in the Coinbase transaction, and it will be, for the year after the activation of NU6, it'll be, 80% to miners, 20% to the whatever the new Cayman Islands FPF, and then 12% to the lockbox. And if that split is then extended past that year, there are some questions about when it makes sense to activate the network sustainability mechanism. But we can get into that a little bit later. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, just one follow-up on that, is what Chris said about not doing a consensus level change, but updating the node software to either have an opt-in configuration or default to 60% of transaction fees being burned. That's something that we are open to considering as instead of doing like the consensus level change, and it was discussed at the last Arborist call.
Oh, can I
But
say something in response to Squirrel's question about attack surface?
yeah, go for it.
Having mandatory coins burnt from some fraction of transaction fees closes off a potential attack, which is that there may be some subtlety to this. Maybe Chris can correct me if I'm overstating this, but basically, we had the sandblasting attack on the network that disabled most wallets for like a year. And the current solution for that is that wallets have to pay higher fees for transactions that use up more of the block space. But currently, any miner can bypass that defense, right? Because the miners collect all the fees, so they can pay themselves. And I guess in general, this is the same reason that Ethereum put burning of part of the transaction fees into EIP 1559, is that any fee that goes to the miner doesn't penalize or deter that miner at all, because they can pay themselves the fees. So when it's burnt, it's a defense that prevents or penalizes people from doing certain things to the network. If it's not burnt, it's a defense against everyone except that miner. It's no defense against them. That makes sense. So basically, I think it's safer. I think it protects the network more from potential future misbehavior, in my opinion.
There's also, just to pile on to that, there's a subtle thing that it does, which it removes a kind of perverse incentive for miners. So, like, if a miner knows they're going to win a block, this is very hypothetical, but like if they have a good chance of winning a block, they might want a spam attack in order to receive fees, right? So that's a little bit of a goofy example, because I think for everything to line up for that to really matter, things would, like, it doesn't seem very plausible right now, but it is kind of a general issue that if we're, introducing ZSAs or having other kinds of fees, every time we're messing with these mechanisms, we want to make sure we're not accidentally incentivizing miners to do something perverse, or just making it zero cost for them to do certain attacks. Yeah. There was one other piece I wanted to mention, which is that in my opinion, the main heart of this proposal is the ZIP 234, smoothing the issuance curve. That's like the main piece to all of this. The other two zips, in my opinion, are kind of like, hey, if we're gonna do 234, here are some things to like get the ball rolling. So zip, in my opinion, zip 233, it's all about burning. Well, you can already burn Zec. The main thing it focuses on is making an explicit public way to burn Zec. And to me, that's really interesting because now there's like this mechanism where people can, if we have 234, so that burning is kind of a donation to future issuance, um, people can publicly demonstrate like, hey, I support Zcash, and here's, here's how I'm showing that I'm burning X Zec. And I'm kind of curious or interested what kinds of things could be built on this. So, right, it could just be a social thing. Um, uh, people do it as like a tithe or something, and they or to brag for the status or things like that. Um, or there might also be like mechanisms that can be built on top of that. So one that I was just speculating about is it might be fun to have like a forum where in order to have an account that can post, you have to demonstrate you've burned a certain amount of Zec or something like that, so that it would be sort of a forum where the people with the voice bit are only people who are donating regularly. And that's just like an example experiment thing that could be built outside of consensus. But it's one example of why I like this idea of making um, burning sort of more explicit and public. If you want,
There's an interesting relationship between that and there's another zip that is up for consideration for NU7, which is the extended memo zip. In order to demonstrate that you have provably burned, one way to do that is with the authenticator reply to address feature, which we are attempting to specify a change in the way that memos are handled to make it so that you can actually provide those proofs. You can, and essentially these two working together can make that that sort of thing just sort of natively available in the protocol.
Yeah, I'd really like to
yeah, I
join
actually,
I'd really like to join the forum where everyone else who can post in that forum has anonymously proven that they burned one Zec. That's all. That'd be awesome.
All right, so before we get to ZIP 234, which is the smoothing of the issuance curve that Nate alluded to, I want to build on this a little bit and focus on use cases. So, like, what specific use cases does the NSM enable that you're most excited about? Um, in like we've so far, what we've talked about is in the immediate term, it enables like donations that you could make to network sustainability in each transaction you make out of your mobile wallet. Or Zuko and I talked to a mining pool that indicated that they wanted to enable miners to donate to the via the NSM. Like we said, transaction fees are too small to make a difference. It just sort of gives us the ability to test out the functionality. Nate, you had mentioned some interesting immediate term use cases like identity badges that enable token gated communities. What are some other use cases that this enables, both in the short term or the long term?
can I wanted to speak a little bit about burning the transaction fees.
Sure.
Um, because I do feel like that's kind of a base use case. So it's kind of funny that people point out that the amount is really low. I see that as an indicator that now is the best time to start doing that. Because when like when EIP 1559 activated, transaction fees were a significant part of miner revenue, and so it was a little bit contentious or controversial. And my thinking is, I doubt miners care about transaction fees much right now, so why don't we just sort of get this into place as a precedent, and then they will have, if transaction fees grow in the future, they will just be sort of natively adapted to this already being in place, so there won't be any contention. So it's kind of a funny flip side benefit to doing it now. And there's another reason that I'm pretty keen on that one as a use case, and this is sort of alluding to um, future work that I would like to see done to Zcash, but I haven't really fleshed out. And that is basically implementing more of EIP 1559. So the reason I think we should do that relatively soon is that if there is like a wave of demand, what I would like to see is that the network, so if basically if there's a wave of demand that's larger than the capacity of the network, I would like to see it respond in a resilient way that um, that keeps the network working, at least for the people who are paying higher fees. Because the way I'm imagining uh, implementing that is something like EIP 1559, where there would be kind of a standard network rate that diminishes if the network is below capacity and grows exponentially if the network is above capacity. Um, and if this fee burning is in place before that, it seems like a good first step because, um, like I alluded to earlier, if the fees grow large, the miners might care more about them. So it'd be nice if this were already in place. And then secondly, if that does happen and fees escalate, like let's say there's kind of a wave of adoption and it's sustained so that the network, like the dynamic fee escalates to some higher rate and it's just staying up there. Well, what that would mean with ZIP 234 and ZIP 235, which is the network um, sustainability mechanism plus a portion of transaction fees being burnt, that would mean that that's sort of supporting future issuance. But it would also, to me, be a clear, unambiguous signal that now is the time to start working on scalability. Because one way we can think about scalability, like with scalability, one question that always comes up is like, should we build it now before they come? Because that might be a waste, or should we wait until there's a lot of demand and then build it? And there's sort of this ambiguity of knowing when to do that. In this future world with these dynamic network fees, we would sort of have more of an objective thing. Like if the fees seem too high for important use cases or important users, then we know, hey, if we improve scalability today, it will enable these users, these current users. And to me, that seems really powerful. So I feel like there's kind of a dance back and forth with the sort of dynamic fee thing, which keeps the network resilient if it's over capacity, but also knowing when and how to scale. So I don't know how to, I don't think I've explained that very well anywhere yet, but it's important to me, and it's sort of like a bigger picture thing that I hope we can get more people talking about.
You did share that. I think it was from ultrasound.money, the ETH tracker that shows like its inflation. And you kind of said like, I'm looking forward to a Zcash version where Zcash becomes super deflationary.
Yeah.
Because with I think the dynamic fee adjustment, the more people that use it, the more fees are burned, the more is available in NSM, and yeah, it's all around good.
That is good, except I do think there's an important story. So I think one thing that like Bitcoin and maybe Ethereum have sort of settled on is like, yes, fees will just keep growing indefinitely, and that's good, and it'll force people onto second layers. and that's the best way to do scaling. I don't know if I agree with that. So I don't necessarily think it's an unambiguous good for fees to raise, even though it does support issuance through the NSM. I still want both like scalability and um, the NSM and the fees. So, and I also tend to um, be optimistic or tend to believe that if fees are high and then we do scale so that fees lower, that's likely to um, pay off in terms of just gaining that much more adoption, which should make Zcash that much more valuable. So to me, that seems like the best way forward. And so I don't want, one thing I've been worried about is people might assume with the NSM that we have a vision that's kind of like Bitcoin, which is like, no, we aren't going to scale. You're just going to have to pay more. And I don't think that works out well in the big picture or the long term. So I don't want to give anyone that impression.
I like the way the NSM, to me, it feels like it's going to make things like safer and more sustainable regardless of the unknown future developments.
Zuko, what are some additional ideas for fee burning that you think are attractive use cases for the NSM?
Something Zcash shielded assets. If Zcash shielded assets get a lot of usage, then people are like using the Zcash network to hold other assets instead of ZAC, and they should pay the whole Zcash community for the sustainability of the network itself and the development and maintenance and security defense and everything. And it seems to me that the native, like, there's currently two ways you can contribute to, or maybe, yeah, anyway, there's around two ways that you can contribute. One is pay a transaction fee that just goes to the next miner, and the other is donate to a specific organization. And the NSM, to me, feels like the sort of the ultimate way that everyone should be expected to contribute, because it credibly neutrally goes to the whole Zcash project at once. So in the future, people are storing their ZSAs. They're getting security and privacy and availability and like reliability from putting them on the Zcash network. Then they ought to pay the Zcashers for that. And the only good way I can think of to pay the Zcashers is to have the NSM.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There are a couple other use cases that I really like that I think complement that are sort of, and that's this idea of, there's been a lot of conversations about over the years about um, like deprecating the transparent pool. And one idea would be that um, people who transact or store their ZAC on exchanges or in T addresses could have a small percentage of their value burned to compensate, you know, people who use Gcash's privacy preserving technology. And
Yeah. And
that,
that
so
should
I,
be expressed as a fee.
yeah,
Like, people are used to having to pay fees. Like, if you take up a parking spot or whatever, you got to pay a fee because that just helps the whole society run smoother. And so the Zcashers could institute fees for um, transacting or storing things in transparent addresses or other things. Anything that is sort of a cost to the whole network should pay a fee to the whole network to compensate for that cost, and the NSM is the right way to pay fees to the whole network.
yeah. So another example of that would be like older shielded pools like Sapling. You could institute a similar fee that sort of encourage people to use the newer technology in Orchard.
Yeah, because people storing their ZEC in old sapling pool is costing the whole network. It's increasing security risk for all the users. It's increasing the complexity and the storage load on all the full nodes. and it's slowing down the engineers because they have to remember and deal with it every time they do anything. So that's fine if they want to do that, and if they choose to do that, that's fine. But they should compensate the rest of the Zcashers for doing it.
Agreed.
Something interesting that I could add here is in discussion with Dismad like 2 days ago, we found that on average, daily transactions, shielded transactions are almost 40%. And like if you consider that only 10% of Zcash is shielded, then yeah, those transparent people that transparent coins are mostly dormant.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Neat. I'm gonna go look up statistics about that. Or you could post on the Twitter thread if you have any data about that I could browse.
Will do.
And one last use case I wanted to bring up was one that I included in the forum post, and that's this idea that Christopher Goes suggested when he announced the strategic partnership between Namada and Zcash, where there would be a way to sort of donate NAM across a bridge to the Zcash Sustainability Fund. I think that would be a really cool use case that maybe could also extend to other projects that use Zcash's technology as a way to sort of pay back the ecosystem and in some sort of neutral manner, like versus doing like an airdrop to users or something along those lines. But real quick, we have about 15 minutes, maybe a little bit more left. I wanted to spend some time talking about ZIP 234. So there's been some controversy about smoothing out the issuance curve and whether or not there are alternatives to the method that we've proposed. Zuko, in this morning's call, you had mentioned that when Nate first proposed that to you, you were sort of taken aback, and then after thinking about it, you were sort of quick to realize that this was the actually simplest way to do it. So
Well,
do you,
even more than that, it was the only way I could think of. So when Nate first suggested the exponential curve or the smoothed curve, which we now have encoded into that zip. So many years ago when Nate first proposed that, I felt like, oh, that seems unnecessarily complicated or something. There should be a better way to do it. And then after I thought about it, I couldn't think of any other way to do it. And now recently, some other people in the Zcash like core developer community have said similar to what I said years ago. They're like, hey, that seems like there's maybe some downsides to that smoothed 4-year curve, and maybe we should do it differently. And so I'm really hoping some of them come up with a specific proposal, because when they try that, they will either realize there isn't any other way to do it, or they will come up with a new way to do it, which I would love to see.
So actually, this is something that Dara, Emma, and Strad and I discussed yesterday, and
Awesome.
if so, I can summarize it pretty quickly. If you consider at any point, like any point in the halving cycle, there's a certain percentage of for that entire halving cycle, for every block, there's a certain percentage of future issuance that's being minted in that block, and the alternate approach to the continuous curve would be that percentage, the value gets scaled by the future issuance at that time, right?
I
So
don't really understand. Go
okay,
on.
so let's say that it's right after the first halving, right? And
Uh-huh.
50% of Zcash remains to be issued, right? So each block within that period burns, 4 years divided by number of blocks, or 4 years times number of blocks in a year, um, one over that worth of that 50%, right?
It issues that much? It creates that much?
It issues uh, it issues essentially, yes, that much. So
Okay.
then if there's burning, then you have a value that is, you're still wanting to burn the same proportion, but it's just the same proportion of a different unissued value.
Yeah, I think
And
that's the
what
same
it
as our
results
current
in,
zip
if you
proposal.
graph this, it's a little bit funny if you graph it out, um, because it creates, instead of this step function that we see with the existing issuance graphs,
Hmm.
it creates kind of a sawtooth function where over the course of a halving, the the absolute value of issuance actually increases, and then you have a big drop, and then over the course of the next halving period, you have a slight increase in value and then drops.
Hmm.
So anyway,
Interesting.
it's we again we talked through it. It's I think it's more complicated, and the one thing that I did want to bring up here, specifically with respect to the to zip 234, and this is actually something that we need at least a concrete parameter for today, um, is that is when do we want the the mechanism to activate? So
Hmm.
Yeah, go
at
ahead.
the original proposal had been that this would activate with network upgrade 6, which activates in just like 15 or 18 days now.
Whoops, too
Um,
late.
and yep, it's not going in there. That would have activated it at the beginning of a halving cycle, which would have effectively pulled issuance forward. So instead of issuance dropping immediately in half, immediate issuance would have dropped very slightly, and then dropped very slightly, and dropped very slightly throughout, according to the curve throughout the halving cycle. Now, with the idea of zip 234 being implemented in NU7, we actually need as a community to decide when should it activate. And I think that it wouldn't make sense for it to activate prior to halfway through the next halving cycle, or the crossover point between the graphs, because if that were to happen, then issuance would be going along flat, 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 and then it would jump up to reach the
Hmm.
curve
Hmm.
Yeah.
and then start declining. So, you know,
And if it
just
lands, if it activates, sorry.
yeah, if it activates instead at the crossover point, then it will essentially mean that uh, issuance then starts declining at that point. And I think that's probably a better. It's easier to reason about that from an economic standpoint.
And that point is exactly halfway between two halvings, right?
Uh,
So like November 2026.
yeah, I think so. I mean, it would be necessary to just do the math and find the intersection, right?
Mm.
And figure out like
I think
at
the
what block they're
intersection
equal.
is I th yeah, I am not certain about this, but I thought it was halfway through.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's how the curve is designed, but there are some constants in that curve and adjustments. It's easiest just to do the math, find the block at which the two intersect, and say that it activates that block or the next block.
Hmm.
But if that's the case and we wanted to do it then it wouldn't be something that would have to be decided and included in for NU7's block height, right? Like it would be
Well,
something.
yeah.
Well,
Sorry,
that
Go
that,
ahead.
that, that depends. So it depends on the timing of that activation relative to the activation of NU7. Like, is NU8 going to be out in time? We don't really have a good idea of what's in NU8 yet, right? But is NU8 going to be happening in time for that to happen? Now, it could be that one would say, oh, well, we're just not going to do this in NU7 because it doesn't need to activate with NU7. And then we're going to plan for NU8 to follow on afterwards with the NSM smoothing. And that actually, that we then schedule the NU8 activation for that crossover point or something like that. That would be a way to do it.
Jason.
That seems to me, that seems more risky because everything I know about network upgrades is like the more constraints get imposed on the schedule, more people's hair catches on fire
Yeah,
who
I
are
definitely
working
agree to
on
that.
the
But I can
upgrade.
point something out. It doesn't. There's a big advantage to changing the consensus rules now, even if it's going to activate years from now, because
I
that
totally
gives,
agree.
yeah, what Chris is saying. So Jason, if we all agreed that, like, the Zcash community as a whole agreed that NSM ought, or those exponential curve part of NSM, the smoothing curve part of NSM, ought to kick in between the two halvings, whatever block that is, sometime in late 2026. Then, in my opinion, it would give everyone, like miners and investors and everyone, more confidence if that got baked in and approved through the Zcash governance process and baked into the consensus rules ASAP. And then everyone could see that 2 years from now, there's this inevitable change to the economics that's going to happen, which cannot be changed without the overwhelming process of a Zcash governance process and a new network upgrade. Does that make sense?
That totally makes sense, but I wonder if it's, like, realistic. Like, the things that we've been talking about with the core development teams or the node implementers is stuff like, "Hey, we have this complexity budget, and including this in NU7 would exceed that, and, we have these other alternative ideas that you should consider, and, we sort of need to flesh out." So,
So
like, in terms of NU7 activating in August of 2025, like, do we have enough time to have it included?
I can't speak for all of the core developers here. Um, I think that there are two things here. One is that I think that Zip 233 is just a very straightforward thing to activate in NU7, that the burning can commence um, more or less immediately. With because that's not the smoothing mechanism. Secondly, I think that if the smoothing mechanism is implemented and just has an activation point that is in the future, um, I don't think that imposes the same complexity cost essentially as it does if the smoothing mechanism were to activate immediately.
Hmm.
And I tend to agree with Zuko that I think that having these rules baked into the protocol sooner rather than later is a good idea. And the the other reason that I think that it's not too big of a deal to include this in NU7 is that it's not that significant of a change in terms of implementation. Um, it's a change in a very specific function, which is what is the block reward for this block,
Hmm.
essentially. But that's a small surface area, and so that's easy to audit. That's easy to make function in a very targeted fashion, and I I don't have that same concern about complexity, particularly if it doesn't activate immediately.
Hmm.
Okay, if we
Awesome.
want to go that route, then what are the next steps? Like, I mean,
So the next step there is, if possible, to do this today, because today is the semantic stability deadline.
Hmm.
Um,
yeah.
uh, make change zip 234 to make the activation height a parameter to that zip, and then recommend an activation height that is one block after the crossover point. Um,
Awesome.
that's what I would ask be done today. Also, folks, I have a hard stop here, so I'm going to be dropping off. But
Thanks,
this has been
Chris.
great.
Thanks,
Thank
Chris.
I'm
you.
excited. This is going to be
Thanks,
awesome.
Chris.
See y'all.
Thanks.
Okay, well, we should talk about.
Commence the burning.
Yeah. Um,
After,
I'm curious
go on.
Go ahead.
if any other listeners have questions or concerns, because it sounded to me like um, the three of us from Shielded Labs and Chris kind of had similar understandings about everything. Um, and now I'm just curious how to know how much support there is in the community for this overall.
Yeah, I'm curious of.
I've seen some thumbs up emojis, but
Squirrel
yeah.
had some good questions earlier on. I wonder if they really got answered.
Let me add Squirrel in. Looks like he's no longer a speaker. But yeah, I'm very curious about that, especially as it relates to 234, because I've talked to a bunch of people about the NSM over the last year or so, and most people are supportive in theory or neutral. There have been very few people that have been like opposed to it, but this one sticking point has always been the smoothing of the issuance curve. And Jason, I'm curious if you being very in tune with the community as part of ZachHub, if you've heard any chatter or any concerns raised. Let's see if I can invite him to speak. Okay, well, he's now a listener. I tried inviting him to speak, but
Anybody else have questions?
okay. Well, if you have questions, you know where to find us. Definitely, there's a thread on the forum that hasn't had too many responses, but has had a few, and you can feel free to ask questions. You can DM me or anybody else on Twitter or the forum or Discord, and we can talk there if you don't want to make your questions public. Oh, Jason.
Hey, sorry. I stepped down in case anyone wanted to come up and ask a question. So I'll do that again.
Okay. All right, Nate, Zuko, was there anything else you wanted to say? If not, we can, I guess, end it here.
We got to go update that zip and resubmit it in time for today's deadline on semantically stable zips. I'm really excited that we could potentially get NSM, the smoothing part, which is like the most important part, baked in to NU7. Yes, go, go, go.
Okay, let's
accelerate.
Do it. All right, thanks everybody for attending, and yeah, take care. Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone. Bye.